Well, fans, it's been a fun time hanging out with Charles Darwin during Project Galapagos. Don't worry, we're not losing him because his work drives the rest of our class. But what I want to do today is figure out, Darwin wasn't like the greatest of all time. I mean, there's some things he just didn't know and some things he got wrong. Let's see what Darwin didn't know.
All right.
Hey now.
Mr. Kovacs class. It's Mr. Kovacs class.
You might learn a ton.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
He's interesting too.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
And he's super cool.
It's Mr. Kovacs class.
All right, so Darwin is famous for a lot of things, but mostly for determining what drives evolution. And he envisioned life was like a tree, started with one single living thing, and then over time, that living thing was shaped by environments into different living things. So like some offspring became one kind of thing, some offspring became other kinds of things. And we call that, he called it the tree of life. And it's a pretty good model of how things probably happen. It kind of shows relationships. That is, the closer your branches are in a tree of life, the more closely a common ancestor existed. So like a flamingo and a penguin have a more recent common ancestor than a flamingo and you and I. And in fact, a flamingo and you and I share the same common ancestor with a kangaroo. Okay, but that's kind of the tree of life, and it works for all life on Earth. And that was the Darwin thing. But there's some things that he kind of missed. He thought that the changes had to always take a really long time, and that's definitely something that we know is not usually the case. In fact, more often than not, changes in species happen in spurts. This was called punctuated equilibrium, but you don't really need to know what this is, but the idea is that basically it's not a gradual change from one to two things. There's something happens and causes a rapid splitting of species. They're like a very, like the Galapagos, right? The Galapagos, the conditions were so different on the Galapagos than they were in South America that there must have been huge death rates. And so that really allowed just a few survivors to found the new species, right? And then they will stay that way until there's another big disruption. So it's kind of like this idea, this is what Darwin I don't think really got, was that species for the most part stay the same. And natural selection keeps them from changing unless there's a big change in the environment. All right, and so let me give you some examples of where natural selection has been measured, or at least we have witnessed natural selection quickly turning one kind of thing into multiple kinds of things, making actual new species. All right, the first example is going to be your part 3 today too, but this is a good example. In North America, there's a tree called the hawthorn. Right, if you look at those look like apples. Okay. They're not apples, but they look like apples. They're very similar to apples, but they're not apples. Apples didn't exist in North America until the 1600s when the colonists brought them from Europe. Okay. So there was a fly called the hawthorn maggot fly that every year after the blossoms turned to fruits, they would meet, mate, and lay their eggs right into the apple. Or into the hawthorn. The hawthorn. And then you can see here the little maggots crawling out. And then the maggots would turn into adult flies. And then, they've overwinter. And then the next year as adult flies, they would meet again on the hawthorns to reproduce. Okay. Now, when apples came, before there were apples, right? Apples don't bloom until later than the hawthorns. So before there were apples, there were always some flies that got there too late, and the hawthorns had already fallen off the tree. Before apples came, that was it. They never passed on their gene. They never got a chance to reproduce. But once the apples came, Well, what do you know? Now there's a place. So they were finally able to reproduce. Okay? But they were passing on the genes to reproduce later in the years. Anyway, to make a long story short, but not that long, 100 years after the introduction of apples, we have hawthorn maggot flies and apple maggot flies, two separate species. They, in the same habitat, they wound up differing into two things that no longer can interbreed. So that's an example of natural selection in like 100 years. Another good example that maybe you've heard of is MRSA. MRSA did not exist 30 years ago. So in the last 30 years, MRSA has become brand new on this planet. It did not appear by magic, right? It appeared by natural selection, right? MRSA is a bacterium, and it's a type of bacteria called a staph bacteria. And staph bacteria have been around for millennia. But this particular species didn't exist until the invention of antibiotics. And antibiotics, I'll go back to that, but antibiotics kill bacteria. And so what happens to bacteria is, like everything else, their genes are subject to mutations or changes from things in the environment. And most of the times, if you get a mutation, it's not good. But sometimes the mutation works if the environment changes. And what happened with MRSA is some of the bacteria had mutations that meant that antibiotics didn't work to kill them. So they survived. Right? And so when somebody gets sick, they would give them antibiotics. Antibiotics would be really effective. It would kill like 99% of the bacteria, except for the ones that had the mutations. Guess who reproduced? That's right, the ones with the mutations. And then they reproduce, and they reproduce, and they reproduce. And now we have a group of bacteria that you can't kill at all. That only took 30 years. But one of my favorite examples is Diane Dodd's experiment with fruit flies. Fruit flies reproduce really quickly. She was able to take a group of fruit flies, just regular fruit flies, took a big group and separated them into two environments that only had one variable between them. That was the type of food they could eat. And she put in one of them the regular kind of starchy food that fruit flies can eat, and the other ones she put in maltose. Maltose is a sugar that most fruit flies can't eat, right? In this container, flies did pretty well. They kind of were regular flies. In this container, there was mass death, but some survived because they had a mutation. And they're the ones that had offspring. And they passed that mutation on to their offspring, which passed their mutation on to their offspring, which passed it on to their offspring. She was able to go from one species of fruit flies, kind of like regular fruit flies, to two species of fruit flies just by changing one thing in the environment in a period of like 11 weeks. 11 weeks to make a brand new thing. It wasn't magic. No fruit flies here changed what they did personally. What made the difference is who lived and who died. And that's natural selection. All right, so as we wrap up our unit here, talk about natural selection, remember a couple things. Number one, that was Darwin's theory, was natural selection. Nobody argues evolution. I mean, the fossil record we know shows that things are different. Natural selection is the mechanism that Darwin proposed. There are some other mechanisms out there that probably work hand in hand, like things like genetic drift and those kinds of things. He did not discover natural selection. He didn't discover evolution. But of course, he presented overwhelming evidence in his book, Origin of Species, so he gets credit for being like the guy. One of the things that he said and that we know now is evolution is not over. It's constantly changing, so we never reach an end. And that kind of scares people because it shows that even our kind of thing is subject to selective pressures, and there will be a point in the future where our kind of thing doesn't exist anymore. I'm not really scared. It doesn't really scare me. It's kind of cool to think about. One thing that people often think, no individual can evolve. So like you don't evolve. The population evolves, and it has to happen over time through variation, heredity, and selection. And then there's some people out there that think that evolution, the idea of evolution, conflicts with religion, and it really does not. Okay? The idea of evolution does not conflict with any real religions. You don't have to believe in evolution. It happens whether you believe in it or not. That's the truth. Where a lot of religions differ is what drives the mechanisms, right? I mean, even the Catholic Church says that, natural selection happens, but they have this feeling that there's some kind of force power that's happening it is guiding it along, whereas most evolutionary biologists say you don't need it. You don't need some kind of blind watchmaker, putting things together. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this topic. I love it. It's one of my personal favorites because it drives the rest of our year. Anyway, we'll wrap it up tomorrow.